Welcome to Napflix. Find a comfortable place, let the noise of the day fade, and allow the pace to slow. Tonight, we'll drift into history, not as a list of dates or battles, but as a quiet story of people, decisions, and moments that slowly reshape the world. You don't need to stay alert. You don't need to remember everything. Just rest, and as you do, let history unfold gently in the background. From expectation to collision, 1940 begins as a consequence. The year opens with armies already mobilized, factories already redirected, and societies already reshaped by war. The systems built in 1939 are in place, staffed, supplied, and waiting. Governments are no longer asking whether war will happen. They are asking how it will unfold. 1939 was the year of construction. 1940 is the year of activation. Plans that had existed on paper now meet terrain, weather, fear, friction, and human limitation. Situations change before responses are issued. But what makes 1940 different is not escalation in the traditional sense. It is not simply more violence, more troops, or more territory. It is the release of pressure built over years of preparation, release of forces that had been constrained by caution, memory, and fear of repetition. What begins in 1940 will not slow down again. It will only spread. Part 1. Military thinking at the start of 1940. At the beginning of 1940, the war was already underway, but in the minds of most military planners, it had not yet truly begun. What existed instead was a shared expectation, across borders, alliances, and command staffs, that this conflict would resemble the last one more than it would challenge it. Armies entered 1940 armed with experience, data, and doctrine drawn overwhelmingly from World War I, a war that had defined an entire generation of military thinking. This inheritance shaped almost every assumption. World War I had taught a brutal lesson. Attacking prepared defenses was catastrophically expensive. Millions of soldiers had died advancing meters at a time. Victory had come not through clever maneuvers, but through endurance, the ability to absorb losses longer than the enemy. From this experience emerged the belief that future wars between major powers would be wars of attrition. Attrition theory is the idea that victory comes from gradually exhausting the enemy's manpower, resources, and morale, rather than through rapid, decisive blows. In this framework, speed is less important than sustainability. War is expected to be long, grinding, and industrial. By 1940, this theory dominated Allied thinking. Closely tied to attrition theory was the emphasis on defensive warfare, which prioritizes holding territory, absorbing attacks, and inflicting losses on an advancing enemy. It assumes that the attacker will pay a higher price than the defender, especially when facing fortifications, prepared positions, and layered defenses. This logic appeared sound. The clearest physical expression of this mindset was the Maginot Line, a vast system of fortifications constructed by France along its eastern border. It was not a symbol of fear, but of confidence in the fact that modern engineering, artillery, and planning could control the battlefield. Static defenses were believed to stabilize war. Static defense logic assumes that holding ground is more important than maneuvering through it. In this view, territory is defended through fixed positions, bunkers, trenches, artillery emplacements, and obstacles. The logic is simple. 1. Fortifications slow the enemy. 2. Slowed enemies are vulnerable. And lastly, vulnerable enemies can be worn down. This approach prioritizes predictability. It assumes that both sides will engage where defenses are strongest and where outcomes are calculable. By early 1940, many Allied planners believed that if war expanded, it would unfold gradually along established fronts, much as it had between 1914 and 1918. In contrast, maneuver warfare was often viewed with suspicion. It emphasizes movement, penetration, and dislocation of enemy forces. Maneuver warfare relies on speed, coordination, and initiative. It seeks to bypass strong points rather than destroy them. Instead of exhausting the enemy, it aims to collapse their ability to respond. To many commanders shaped by World War I, this approach felt reckless. It appeared to gamble organization against chaos and planning against improvisation. Rapid movement was associated with vulnerability, overextension, and logistical failure. Maneuver was seen as something cavalry once did, not something modern industrial armies could sustain. As a result, maneuver warfare was often underestimated or misunderstood. Another defining feature of early 1940 military thinking was rigid command hierarchy. Most armies operated through centralized command structures. Decisions flowed downward from high command. Initiative was limited at lower levels. Orders were detailed, specific, and expected to be followed precisely. This rigidity was not incompetence. It was a response to scale. World War I had involved millions of soldiers. Centralized control had seemed necessary to prevent chaos. In 1940, many armies still believed that discipline and predictability were the foundations of effectiveness. However, rigid hierarchies slow response time. When situations change rapidly, centralized systems struggle to adapt. This vulnerability was not yet fully understood. Importantly, not all lessons from World War I were wrong. Armies correctly understood the importance of logistics, industrial capacity, civilian support, sustained production. What they misjudged was how these elements would interact with speed. They assumed that industrial war required time, that mobilization would be gradual, that fronts would stabilize before collapsing. They did not anticipate a war where industrial power could be mobilized quickly enough to support rapid movement. Why most expected a slow war. By January 1940, the absence of major fighting reinforced these assumptions. The months of relative quiet after September 1939 appeared to confirm that war would be deliberate and restrained. This calm was interpreted as normal. It was not seen as a warning. You cannot understand 1940 without understanding how wrong most assumptions were. The armies of early 1940 were not unprepared. They were prepared for a different kind of war. Their doctrines were logical, historically grounded, and carefully constructed. They were also mismatched to the reality about to unfold. The coming months would not reward endurance alone. They would reward speed, flexibility, and the ability to operate beyond established expectations. Part 2. German Operational Thinking. German success in 1940 did not come from improvisation, recklessness, or superior numbers. It came from a very specific way of thinking about war, a way shaped as much by limitation as by ambition. To understand why speed became Germany's central strategy, it is necessary to look beyond cliches and focus on operational thinking, how battles were connected, sequenced, supplied, and controlled over time. Germany entered the interwar period under severe constraints. The post-World War I settlement limited the size of its army, banned certain weapons, and restricted industrial military output. These constraints reshaped German military thought instead of eliminating it. Unable to rely on mass, Germany focused on efficiency, coordination, and decision speed. This mattered. A smaller force cannot afford long wars. It must win quickly or not at all. A crucial distinction in German thinking was the emphasis on operational warfare, rather than isolated tactical victories. Tactical warfare focuses on winning individual battles. Operational warfare focuses on how those battles connect to break the enemy's overall ability to fight. German planners were less interested in destroying enemy units one by one and more interested in disrupting command, movement, and response. The goal was dislocation and then annihilation. If enemy leadership could not coordinate, supply, or reposition forces, resistance would collapse even if large numbers of troops still existed. One of the most important concepts underlying German speed was mission-type command, known in German as Auftragstaktik. Mission-type command means commanders give objectives, not detailed instructions. Subordinate officers are expected to adapt independently. Initiative is encouraged rather than punished. This philosophy trusted junior officers to act based on intent rather than waiting for permission. In fast-moving situations, this mattered enormously. While more centralized armies waited for orders to move up the chain, German units were already adjusting to changing conditions on the ground. Speed was not just mechanical, it was also very much organizational. Now, what's important to understand is that German use of tanks is often misunderstood. Tanks were not seen as independent shock weapons. They were tools within a broader system. Their value came from concentration, not individual strength. Rather than dispersing armored units across infantry formations, Germany grouped tanks into mobile formations designed to penetrate, exploit, and continue moving. Movement mattered more than holding ground. Territory could be occupied later, but momentum could not be recovered once lost. Another defining feature of German operational thinking was close air-ground coordination. Air power was not treated as a separate domain. Aircraft were integrated into battlefield operations to support movement on the ground. Key functions included disrupting enemy communication, targeting movement and reserves, supporting advances at critical points. This coordination compressed time. Enemy responses arrived late, incomplete, or not at all. Communication as a weapon. Speed depended on communication. German units prioritized radio use at all levels, allowing commanders to adjust plans in real time. This flexibility allowed exploitation of unexpected success. Where other armies required written orders or courier-based communication, German formations could redirect movement quickly. Tempo, the pace at which operations unfold, became a weapon. Contrary to popular belief, speed did not mean ignoring logistics. German planners understood that logistics controlled tempo. Movement could only continue as long as fuel, ammunition, and maintenance followed closely behind. Rather than building massive reserves for prolonged conflict, logistics were designed to support rapid bursts of movement. This worked, temporarily. The system assumed short campaigns. Much of this operational thinking was developed and refined within the Wehrmacht, particularly in its army command structures. The Wehrmacht was the unified armed forces of Germany from 1935 to 1945. It consisted of three main branches: Heer, the Army Kriegsmarine, the Navy Luftwaffe, the Air Force. When historians say that German operational thinking was developed within the Wehrmacht, they are referring primarily to the Army's professional officer corps, especially its planning and training institutions. One of the most influential advocates of armored operational warfare was Heinz Guderian, who emphasized speed, coordination, and independent action. He is important not because he invented modern armored warfare, but because he systematically argued for the concentration of tanks into independent formations, emphasized speed, communication, and coordination, especially through radio use, advocated combining tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support into a single operational system. Guderian believed that tanks should not be scattered to support infantry slowly, as many armies did, but used together to break through defenses and keep moving. He summarized this thinking in his writings and training work during the 1930s, helping shape how armored units were used operationally rather than tactically. However, it is important to note that German success did not depend on one individual. It depended on an institutional culture that valued initiative, flexibility, and rapid exploitation. Why movement mattered more than territory? Germany emphasized movement because it aligned with strategic necessity. Limited resources, limited manpower, vulnerable economy. A long war of attrition would favor opponents with greater industrial depth. Speed offered a way out of that imbalance. Rapid success could prevent full enemy mobilization, undermine political cohesion, create psychological shock. War would be decided before economies could fully engage. That was the theory. German operational doctrine was shaped by post-war restrictions, economic vulnerability, fear of encirclement, the memory of slow collapse in World War I. Speed was not ideology. In this context, it was survival logic. The effectiveness of speed in early 1940 created a dangerous illusion. Success appeared to confirm the doctrine universally. Speed began to look like a solution to every problem. Limits were underestimated. Logistics were stretched. Opponents were assumed to collapse the same way repeatedly. This overconfidence would matter later. What worked brilliantly under specific conditions would be expanded beyond its sustainable limits. German operational thinking explains why 1940 unfolded the way it did. The outcome was not accidental. It was not luck. It was the result of alignment between doctrine, organization, communication, and timing. But this same thinking carried inherent risk. Speed solves problems quickly. It also hides them. 1940 rewards Germany's approach. Later years will expose its limits. Understanding this is essential because the same logic that created early success also shaped the path toward eventual failure. Part 3. Scandinavia and Strategic Geography, April 1940. In April 1940, the war demonstrated something fundamental. Neutrality could not survive strategic necessity. Until this point, Scandinavia had been widely perceived as peripheral, distant from the main fronts, politically neutral, and culturally removed from the central tensions of continental Europe. This perception was shared by civilians and, for a time, by parts of the political leadership across Europe. It was wrong. Scandinavia mattered because of resources, access, and of course, geography. At the center of this importance was iron ore. Germany's war industry depended heavily on high-quality iron ore, much of which came from northern Sweden. During winter months, when Baltic ports froze, this ore was shipped through the Norwegian port of Narvik, then transported south by sea. This created a strategic vulnerability. If these routes were cut, German steel production, and therefore armaments, vehicles, and ammunition, would suffer. This was not a long-term threat. In modern war, supply chains are as decisive as armies. Now, as we discussed earlier, supply is extremely crucial in economic warfare, which is the attempt to weaken an enemy by disrupting their access to critical resources, trade routes, and industrial inputs, rather than by defeating them directly on the battlefield. By early 1940, economic warfare was already underway. Naval blockades, control of shipping lanes, targeting industrial supply routes. Scandinavia sat at the intersection of these pressures. Neutral territory did not remove economic importance, and that can be explained through a very interesting concept, peripheral theater, which is a region considered secondary to the main area of conflict, assumed to be strategically less important or less urgent. Scandinavia was widely treated this way in early planning. This assumption collapsed in April 1940. Peripheral theaters are only peripheral until their resources, routes, or geography become decisive. In total war, distance does not equal irrelevance. Another key concept was maritime choke points. A maritime choke point is a narrow or strategically critical sea route through which shipping must pass. Control over such points allows a power to influence trade, military movement, and economic flow far beyond the immediate area. The Norwegian coastline, fjords, and access to the North Sea created exactly this kind of strategic leverage. Whoever controlled these waters influenced northern shipping routes, access to the Atlantic, naval maneuverability. Neutral control offered no guarantee of security if larger powers believed their survival depended on access. And Germany had some solid plans ready. On April 9, 1940, Germany launched Operation Weserübung. In a coordinated operation, German forces invaded both Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell quickly, offering little resistance. Norway's situation was more complex, involving landings at multiple ports, naval engagements, and prolonged fighting. Why neutrality failed? Neutrality in total war, a form of warfare where entire societies and economies are mobilized, is fragile. Neutrality in total war assumes that non-participation will be respected. But total war treats resources as weapons, geography as leverage, trade as vulnerability. In this context, neutrality becomes conditional. It holds only as long as it does not obstruct strategic necessity. By April 1940, neutrality was no longer sufficient protection. The invasion shocked international observers. It demonstrated that formal declarations, treaties, and diplomatic assurances could be overridden by logistical necessity. It also exposed the limits of deterrence when economic survival was at stake. For smaller states, the lesson was stark. Neutrality did not guarantee safety. It only delayed attention. April 1940 proves a central truth of modern warfare. Resources and geography are targets, not just armies. From this point forward, the war would increasingly be fought over supply routes, industrial inputs, strategic positioning. This shift reshaped the war's logic, and it ensured that no region, however distant or neutral it appeared, could remain untouched once it became strategically necessary. Scandinavia was not a side story in this war. You can say it was a warning. Part 4. The Failure of Allied Assumptions. At the start of 1940, the Allied powers did not believe they were losing. Instead, they believed, or maybe assumed, they were waiting. This distinction matters because Allied failure in 1940 was not the result of ignorance, laziness, or lack of intelligence. It was the result of institutional inertia, systems built to solve one kind of problem being asked to solve a different one. The Allies were not unprepared, but it was like they were prepared for the wrong war. In January and February 1940, Allied military planning was dominated by a single expectation that the war would develop slowly along predictable fronts. This belief shaped everything: force deployment, command structures, political decision-making, public communication. The War of 1914 to 1918 had convinced Allied planners that modern industrial conflict between great powers could not be resolved quickly. This assumption felt rational. It was also decisive, in the wrong way. Allied confidence rested on three pillars. One, numerical and economic strength. Britain and France believed that over time, their combined industrial capacity, global access to resources, and naval power would outweigh Germany's more limited economic base. Time, in their view, was an ally. Two, fortifications and geography. France, in particular, trusted fixed defenses and geography to control the pace of war. The eastern frontier was fortified, terrain was studied, and movement was expected to be channeled into predictable corridors. Three, political control over escalation. Allied leaders believed they could sequence the war, deciding when and where major operations would occur, rather than being forced into rapid reaction. As you can predict by now, this belief would not survive 1940. A critical but often overlooked factor was coalition warfare. Coalition warfare refers to military operations conducted by multiple sovereign states, each with its own political leadership. Military culture, strategic priorities, and domestic constraints. Britain and France were allies, but they were not a single command system. This slowed response. Another structural issue was centralized command rigidity. In centralized systems, orders move upward for approval, decisions move downward for execution. Initiative is limited at lower levels. This model prioritizes control and coordination, which are valuable in slow-moving conflicts, but it creates delay in fast-changing situations. By early 1940, Allied command structures still assumed time to evaluate, time to debate, time to issue precise instructions. What they lacked was exactly that: time. The most visible symbol of Allied assumptions was the French defensive system. Fortifications were not built out of fear, but out of confidence in engineering and experience. Fixed defenses had worked before when combined with time, manpower, and industrial depth. Static defense logic made sense within a predictable framework. It failed when the framework itself collapsed. In January and February 1940, the lack of major fighting appeared to validate Allied assumptions. By March 1940, Allied planners were focused heavily on scenarios they believed most likely, and the events of April 1940, particularly Germany's sudden actions in Northern Europe, exposed the fragility of Allied assumptions. Strategic planning on the Allied side was shaped by senior political and military leadership, particularly within the governments and general staffs of Britain and France. It is tempting to explain Allied failure through personal blame. That explanation is insufficient. What failed in early 1940 was not intelligence or courage, it was institutional alignment. Institutions are designed to solve past problems efficiently. They adapt slowly to new ones. Allied systems were optimized for endurance, coordination, and gradual escalation. The war they faced rewarded speed, initiative, and disruption. This mismatch would have consequences. So if you have to remember it in simple terms and also in a nutshell, the Allies entered 1940 confident not because they underestimated their enemy, but because they trusted systems that had worked before. Those systems did not fail because they were weak. They failed because the environment changed faster than institutions could adjust. This is the central lesson of early 1940. The war was no longer waiting to be managed. Part 5. May 1940. System shock. May 1940 is often described as sudden. It felt sudden to those living through it. It looked sudden to those watching from afar. But it was not accidental. What happened in May was the result of systems colliding with reality and losing the race. By the start of May, all major actors were already committed. Armies were mobilized, plans were written, command structures were in place. On May 10, 1940, German forces launched a coordinated offensive in Western Europe. On the same day, the invasion of the Low Countries began. Strategic assumptions collapsed. Political leadership changed in Britain. That coincidence mattered. War accelerated across military, political, and psychological domains simultaneously. No system had been designed to absorb that much change at once. Speed does not simply move troops faster, it disrupts cognition. When events unfold rapidly, information arrives incomplete, reports contradict one another, decisions are made on outdated data. This creates decision paralysis. Decision paralysis occurs when leaders delay action because available information is too confusing, incomplete, or rapidly changing to support confident choices. Ironically, the more data that arrives at once, the harder decisions become. In May 1940, commanders were not inactive because they were indifferent. They were overwhelmed and shocked. Shock in military terms refers to the sudden disruption of an enemy's ability to function normally, psychologically, organizationally, and cognitively. Shock is not just fear, it is the loss of rhythm. Combined with high tempo, shock prevents systems from reestablishing control. Orders issued in the morning were irrelevant by afternoon. Plans designed for sequential movement faced simultaneous collapse at multiple points. This was not chaos, it was some kind of compressed time. Breakdown of communication. Communication systems were one of the first casualties of speed. Messages arrived late, units moved beyond expected positions, commanders lost track of friendly forces. Because of this, you can assume a lot went wrong, but especially authority becomes unclear. Who decides? Based on what information? At what speed? These questions went unanswered in real time. That's when command coherence comes in. It refers to the alignment between intent, orders, execution, and feedback. In May 1940, this coherence was fractured. High command issued instructions based on assumptions that no longer applied. Field units acted independently to survive immediate pressure, and feedback loops broke down. This was not insubordination. It was an adaptation in the absence of guidance. The system no longer moved as a whole. Political and military leadership faced unprecedented strain. In Britain, Winston Churchill became prime minister on May 10, 1940, inheriting a war already in motion. The timing mattered. Leadership change during system shock amplifies uncertainty. Decisions must be made before authority has fully settled. Elsewhere, military leaders faced collapsing assumptions faster than they could revise them. The issue was not intelligence, it was time. Military organizations are built to function under pressure, but within expected parameters. May 1940 exceeded those parameters. This is the critical lesson of May 1940. The decisive collapse was not material first, it was psychological. Once leaders and institutions lose confidence in their ability to understand events, effectiveness collapses even if resources remain. This is psychological collapse. Armies can recover from losses. They struggle to recover from disorientation. May 1940 introduced this factor decisively. Those who could think, decide, and act faster than events unfolded gained decisive advantage. Those who could not lost coherence before they lost territory. From this point forward, the war would never slow down again. It would only demand faster adaptation or collapse. Part C. France Structure, Politics, and Collapse. By June 1940, something had happened that few in Europe believed possible. France had fallen, not after years of fighting, not after total exhaustion, but in a matter of weeks. The French army, widely regarded as one of the most powerful in the world, ceased to function as a coordinated fighting force. The French government abandoned Paris. Military command fragmented. On June 22, 1940, an armistice was signed, effectively removing France from the war as an active continental power. This collapse was abrupt. Germany did not publicly claim in 1940 that it was invading France to destroy it or occupy it permanently. Instead, the argument rested on four connected claims. 1. We are already at war. France declared it. From Germany's perspective, the war with France did not begin in May 1940. It began on September 3, 1939, when France declared war on Germany following the invasion of Poland. Germany framed this as France choosing confrontation, Germany responding to a state of war that already existed. 2. France is part of a strategic encirclement. A central German claim was that France, together with Britain, was attempting to contain and eventually destroy Germany. This idea was not invented in 1940. It was rooted in post-World War I occupation of German territory, reparations enforcement, military alliances surrounding Germany. German leadership argued that waiting would allow France and Britain to complete mobilization, strengthen air and ground forces, and choose the timing of attack. Germany presented action as preemptive, not aggressive. 3. The Low Countries make France a threat. Germany claimed that France's alliance with Britain and the likelihood that Allied forces would operate through Belgium and the Netherlands made French territory a launch platform for attack. This claim mattered because it allowed Germany to frame the campaign as defensive positioning, not expansion. The logic was simple. Allied forces would move east, Germany must move west first. Neutral territory would be violated either way. Germany argued it was responding to inevitability, not creating it. And 4, a quick decision prevents a long war. Germany also framed the campaign as a way to shorten the war. A long war favored British naval power, French industrial depth, and global resource access. Germany lacked those advantages. Therefore, German leadership argued that decisive action would avoid prolonged civilian suffering, prevent economic collapse, and in turn, force negotiations. Speed was presented as humane. Behind the argument lay a different reality. Germany's leadership understood that France was not preparing an immediate invasion. Allied planning was slow and defensive. And most importantly, time favored the Allies. Germany waiting reduced its chances of winning. Germany's justification resonated internally because it emphasized survival over ambition and presented war as unavoidable. Germany's argument for entering France illustrates a recurring pattern in modern war. Wars are rarely presented as choices. They are presented as responses. Aggression is framed as prevention. This framing does not require public belief forever. It only needs belief long enough for action to become irreversible. By the time the justification could be questioned, the campaign was already underway, and the outcome had already reshaped Europe. In short, Germany did not say, "We are invading France." It said, "We are already at war, so, might as well." Right? For contemporaries, the speed of France's defeat was more disturbing than the defeat itself. France had prepared extensively for war. It had mobilized millions of soldiers, built vast defensive systems, and entered the conflict alongside allies. Nothing about its position suggested imminent collapse. And yet, within 6 weeks of sustained fighting, the system failed. This raised an urgent question. How does a major power fall so quickly? The answer does not lie in cowardice, incompetence, or lack of resources. It lies in the interaction between political structure, military organization, and of course speed, and in how those systems respond when assumptions collapse. It is from this point that the analysis begins. At the start of 1940, France remained one of Europe's great powers, a large, experienced army, extensive fortifications, industrial capacity, a global empire, formal alliances. Nothing about France suggested the inevitability of collapse, and yet within weeks the state would cease to function as a coherent military power. Now we need to understand that France entered the war politically fragmented. The French Third Republic was marked by frequent changes in government, fragile coalitions, and deep ideological divisions. These divisions did not cause defeat, but they shaped how the crisis was handled. Political leadership prioritized civilian oversight, legal continuity, parliamentary procedure. These priorities were democratic in principle. In fast-moving war, they slowed response. Civilian control of the military is a foundational principle of democratic governance. It ensures that armed forces remain subordinate to elected authority. In France, this control was strong. However, in 1940, it created tension. Military commanders required rapid freedom of action. Political leaders required consultation, approval, and consensus. This gap widened as tempo increased. That wasn't the issue alone. French military command structures were layered and formal. Orders moved from political leadership through senior military command down multiple levels. Each step ensured accountability. Each step consumed time. As events accelerated, this structure struggled to adapt. A crucial conceptual misunderstanding lay at the heart of French planning. This introduced with us to two core concepts: strategic depth. which refers to the overall space a country has to absorb attack and continue fighting. Operational depth, which refers to the ability to respond dynamically within that space, to maneuver, counterattack, and regain initiative. France possessed strategic depth in theory. It lacked operational depth in practice. Soldiers could still fight. The system could no longer explain why, where, or for how long. We have a few important dates that you should remember. May-June 1940, rapid deterioration of France's military position. June 14, 1940, German forces enter Paris. June 16, 1940, political leadership collapses, calls for an armistice intensify. June 22, 1940, France signs an armistice with Germany. The armistice did not end the war. It ended France's ability to fight it as a unified state. Two figures came to symbolize divergent responses. Philippe Pétain argued that continued resistance would lead only to destruction. He emphasized preservation of lives and institutions through accommodation. Charles de Gaulle rejected this logic. He argued that France's defeat was military, not final, and that legitimacy could continue beyond occupation. Their disagreement was not personal. It just reflected two competing definitions of survival. France's collapse reshaped the war instantly. The continental balance of power disappeared. Germany no longer faced a major Western land opponent, and Britain stood isolated. Strategic calculations everywhere shifted. It was a structural rupture. After June 1940, resistance changed meaning. It no longer meant holding territory. It meant preserving legitimacy, identity, and future possibility. Some resistance would be military. Much would be political, cultural, and psychological. The collapse of France teaches a difficult lesson. Power is not only measured by capability, it is measured by the ability to adapt when assumptions fail. France could fight. Its system could not keep pace. Part 7. Retreat as Survival. In 1940, retreat became a decision. This shift is one of the most important conceptual changes of the war, and it emerged not from theory, but from necessity. As systems collapsed and fronts dissolved, survival itself became strategic. The goal was no longer to hold ground at all costs, but to preserve the ability to continue fighting at all. This redefinition would permanently change how modern war understood success and defeat. Traditional military thinking had long treated territory as the primary measure of success. Ground held was equated with advantage. Ground lost implied weakness. In 1940, this logic broke down. Territory could be lost faster than it could be defended. Once systems of command and communication fractured, holding ground became meaningless if the forces defending it could not be sustained, supplied, or coordinated. What mattered instead was force preservation. If you are wondering what that means, even though I know you already know the meaning, let me explain it. Force preservation refers to the deliberate effort to save trained personnel, equipment, and organizational structure, even at the cost of abandoning territory. The logic is simple but radical. A preserved force can fight again. A destroyed force cannot. A strategic retreat is not a rout. It is an organized withdrawal designed to prevent encirclement, preserve combat power, and regain flexibility. In 1940, retreat became necessary because holding positions no longer guaranteed stability. Static defense without coherence became a liability. Withdrawal offered the only way to restore control. This logic was deeply counterintuitive to leaders shaped by earlier wars, where retreat had often preceded collapse. But conditions had changed. The most visible expression of this shift was the evacuation of Allied forces from northern France in late May and early June 1940. What became known as was not originally conceived as a symbolic event. It was a logistical emergency. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were at risk of being cut off and destroyed. The decision to withdraw prioritized survival over position. One of the defining features of this retreat was civilian involvement. Civilian vessels, fishing boats, ferries, private craft, were mobilized alongside naval forces. This was not a planned doctrine. It was improvisation under pressure. Civilian participation mattered for three reasons. Material effect. It increased evacuation capacity. Psychological effect. It reinforced social cohesion. And narrative effect. It reshaped how retreat was understood. War became collective. How events are described matters as much as what happens. The evacuation was not framed as victory, but it was also not framed as surrender. Language emphasized endurance, survival, and continuation rather than loss. Narrative framing does not change facts. It changes interpretation. In 1940, framing retreat as survival preserved morale and legitimacy. It allowed societies to process loss without collapse. Historically, mass withdrawal often signals the end of resistance. In 1940, it did the opposite. By preserving forces, retreat enabled continued participation in the war. It shifted the struggle from immediate confrontation to long-term endurance. This logic was new at this scale. Retreat no longer meant conceding the future. 1940 forced a redefinition of success. Success was no longer measured solely by territory held, battles won. It was measured by forces preserved capacity to continue organizational survival. This change had profound consequences for how the war would be fought afterward. The concept of retreat as survival reshaped modern warfare. It demonstrated that losing ground did not always mean losing the war, that survival itself could be strategic, that morale could be maintained even in withdrawal if purpose was preserved. 1940 did not just change the map, it changed the logic. From this point forward, wars would be judged not only by victories and defeats, but by whether a society could absorb shock and continue. Retreat became a form of resistance, and survival became a strategy. Part 8. Britain's Strategic Transformation. Britain did not plan to fight the war alone. At the beginning of 1940, British strategy was built around cooperation, with France as the primary continental partner and with the expectation that any major war would be fought with allies on the continent over time. Britain's strength was understood as cumulative: naval power, economic endurance, imperial reach, and alliance coordination. That framework collapsed in June 1940. What followed was a strategic transformation that reshaped Britain's understanding of war, defense, and survival. The fall of France in June 1940 produced an immediate and unprecedented situation. For the first time in centuries, Britain faced the prospect of confronting a dominant continental power without a major European ally. The geographic reality of being an island had not changed, but its strategic meaning had. Britain now stood, without a land front on the continent, without allied armies to absorb pressure, and most importantly, within range of hostile air power. The war ceased to be something Britain supported from a distance. It became something that could reach British soil directly. This transformation occurred alongside a major political shift. On May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Churchill inherited a war already accelerating, an alliance system collapsing, a population facing uncertainty. Leadership mattered not because it changed material conditions overnight, but because it shaped interpretation and response. Political leadership during crisis performs two functions: decision-making under uncertainty, meaning-making for the population. Both were critical. Britain's pre-1940 strategy assumed that its primary role was supporting continental operations. After June 1940, that assumption no longer applied. The strategic question shifted from, how do we support allies on the continent, to how do we prevent invasion and remain in the war at all? This required a fundamental reorientation, and that's where island defense logic comes in. Island defense logic treats geography as the primary strategic asset. Britain's survival now depended on control of surrounding seas, control of airspace above the island, denial of enemy access rather than occupation of enemy territory. The objective was to deny air superiority, deny sea crossings, deny the conditions required for invasion. This was defensive in posture, but existential in importance. This shift elevated air power doctrine from a supporting role to a decisive one. Air power doctrine concerns how air forces are used to control skies, protect territory, and influence ground and naval operations. By mid-1940, British survival hinged on preventing enemy control of British airspace, protecting industrial centers and ports, maintaining civilian morale under air attack. Air power was no longer about battlefield support. It was about national survival. This set the conditions for sustained aerial confrontation over Britain later in 1940. One of the most important and often misunderstood aspects of Britain's transformation was the elevation of morale to a strategic concern. Morale is not simply optimism or courage. In strategic terms, morale refers to a society's willingness to endure hardship, continue production, accept loss without collapse. Britain understood that it could not match its opponent immediately in continental power. What it could do was remain functional. Political communication, civil defense measures, and public messaging were designed to sustain coherence rather than promise quick victory. Morale became a form of resistance. What preceded this transformation? Britain's sudden pivot was so jarring precisely because of what came before. British planning had assumed long-term alliance with France, gradual escalation, war fought away from British cities. Those assumptions shaped force deployment, resource allocation, public expectations. When they collapsed, adaptation had to be immediate. What followed was total national mobilization. Total mobilization means that industry is redirected toward war production. Civilian life is reorganized around defense. Government authority expands into daily life. Factories, transportation, communication, and labor were all reoriented towards sustaining resistance. Civil defense systems expanded. Air raid precautions became routine. The boundary between civilian and military effort dissolved. British institutions adapted quickly. Naval power remained crucial, but air defense and industrial resilience now took precedence. Coordination between government departments intensified. Decision-making centralized around the survival imperative. Speed of adaptation became as important as strength. Britain's strategic transformation in 1940 reshaped the war. By redefining success as survival rather than immediate victory, Britain remained a participant when defeat seemed plausible. This ensured that the conflict did not end in continental domination. Britain did not win in 1940, but it did something just as important. It remained, and by remaining, it ensured that the war would continue long enough for the balance of power to shift again. That decision, forged under pressure and isolation, would shape everything that followed. Part 9. War enters civilian space. By 1940, the geography of war expanded decisively. The battlefield no longer ended at the front line. It moved into cities, factories, neighborhoods, and homes. This was not an accident of technology. It was a consequence of how modern war defined victory. Earlier wars had focused primarily on defeating enemy armies. In 1940, that focus widened. Industrial capacity, transportation networks, and civilian morale became central targets because they sustained military power. This shift reflected the logic of total war. Total war is a form of conflict in which entire societies, not just armed forces, are mobilized and targeted. Industry produces weapons. Transportation moves armies. Civilians sustain production. As a result, civilians become strategically relevant. Once this logic takes hold, the separation between front and home collapses. Air power made this shift operational. Aircraft could bypass front lines and strike directly at industrial centers, ports and rail hubs, urban populations. Strategic bombing aimed not only to destroy factories, but to disrupt daily life. Power grids, housing, and transportation were all vulnerable. In 1940, cities were no longer rear areas. They were part of the war zone. Organizations such as the THEY and became instruments not just of military engagement, but of societal pressure. Air raids introduced a new reality, danger without warning. Strategic bombing explained. Strategic bombing refers to the use of air power to attack an enemy's economic base, infrastructure, and morale, rather than battlefield units alone. The theory assumed that disrupting production would weaken armies. Disrupting civilian life would weaken resolve. This theory was contested, but widely adopted. In 1940, strategic bombing was still evolving, but its psychological impact was immediate. Sirens, blackouts, and sudden destruction reshaped how civilians experienced war. Fear became intermittent rather than constant, unpredictable, intrusive, and exhausting. As cities became targets, governments responded with civil defense systems. Civil defense included air raid warnings, blackout regulations, shelters and evacuation plans, firefighting and rescue coordination. These systems served two purposes: physical protection, psychological stabilization. Preparation reduced panic. Routine restored a sense of control. Civil defense turned civilians into participants rather than passive victims. We need to understand home front militarization, which describes the process by which civilian life is reorganized around war requirements. By 1940, factories shifted production schedules. Labor was redirected. Daily routines adapted to emergency conditions. This did not require uniforms or weapons. It required compliance, endurance, and coordination. The home front became an extension of the battlefield. Survival under air attack demanded psychological resilience. Resilience is not the absence of fear, it is the ability to continue functioning despite it. Governments understood that fear could not be eliminated. It had to be managed. Messaging emphasized normalcy, continuity, collective responsibility. Resilience became strategic. A population that continued to work, produce, and cooperate could sustain war effort even under attack. Factories, docks, and power stations were attacked not because they were symbolic, but because they were essential. Industry linked civilian labor directly to military outcomes. Destroying a factory did not just reduce output, it disrupted schedules, displaced workers, and strained morale. War became systemic. 1940 erased a boundary that had defined earlier conflicts. Once civilians became central to strategy, war became total in practice, not just in name. This shift would shape everything that followed: how wars were fought, how societies endured, how victory and survival were defined. The war was no longer happening somewhere else. By 1940, it was happening everywhere. Part 10: The Global Reaction to 1940. By the end of 1940, the war had not yet reached every continent, but it had reached every calculation. What changed in 1940 was not simply the number of countries fighting. It was the realization that distance no longer guaranteed safety and neutrality no longer guaranteed time. The speed and scale of events forced governments worldwide to reassess their assumptions, their vulnerabilities, and their timelines. The war became global in logic before it became global in law. The rapid collapse of multiple European states in 1940 sent a clear signal beyond Europe. Military power could shift suddenly, alliances could dissolve quickly, long-term planning could be overtaken by events. This shockwave altered behavior even among countries that were not formally at war. The central question everywhere became the same: if this can happen there, how long before it happens here? Countries that had attempted to remain neutral now faced a dilemma. Neutrality had historically been a legal and diplomatic position. In 1940, it became a strategic gamble. Neutral states reassessed their geographic exposure, their economic dependencies, their military readiness. Neutrality no longer meant disengagement. It meant preparing quietly while avoiding provocation. Some states strengthened defenses, others adjusted trade. All adjusted expectations. A new category of involvement emerged: non-belligerent participation. Non-belligerent states were not formally at war, but they were no longer neutral in practice. They supplied material, shared intelligence, adjusted production, and positioned forces defensively. This blurred the line between war and peace. The world began to operate in gradients of involvement, not binary states of war or neutrality. One of the most significant reactions to 1940 was industrial. Governments recognized that modern war was decided as much by factories as by armies. This realization accelerated industrial mobilization even outside active combat zones. Production capacity became a strategic asset. This gave rise to what historians call arsenal economies. An arsenal economy is an economy structured to supply war material, weapons, vehicles, fuel, equipment, either for its own defense or for others. Such economies may not be at war themselves, but their output shapes the war's outcome. In 1940, industrial power began to substitute for immediate military action. Factories became leverage. Another concept reshaped by 1940 was strategic timing. Strategic timing refers to decisions about when to act rather than whether to act. Governments weighed immediate intervention versus delayed preparation, risk of escalation versus risk of being unprepared, short-term stability versus long-term security. After 1940, delay was no longer seen as neutral. Waiting became a decision with consequences. Several developments reinforced. American leadership recognized that industrial capacity could shape outcomes. Geographic distance no longer ensured insulation. Economic involvement carried strategic weight. This marked the early stages of a transformation from observer to participant, not through declarations, but through production and supply. International coordination expanded quietly. Economic planning bodies, military liaison missions, and industrial agreements proliferated. These were not alliances in name, but they functioned as infrastructure for future alignment. The architecture of a wider war was being built in advance. 1940 demonstrated that speed can overwhelm planning, geography can be bypassed, neutrality can be overridden, safety became conditional. It depended not on intention, but on capability and readiness. Even countries far from the fighting understood that modern war could reach them indirectly through trade disruption, resource competition, or political pressure. 1940 internationalized the war without formal declarations. The world entered a state of anticipatory conflict, where governments acted as if war might arrive at any moment, even if it had not yet been declared. This changed everything: economic priorities, military planning, diplomatic posture. The war expanded not by crossing borders, but by reshaping decisions. By the end of 1940, the question was no longer who is at war. It was who is ready. And in that shift, the war's true global nature emerged, quietly, decisively, and without ceremony. Part 11, Technology and Warfare Shift 1940, is often remembered for movement, armies advancing, borders collapsing, governments retreating. But beneath that movement was a quieter transformation. Technology did not suddenly become more advanced in 1940. What changed was how technology was used, integrated, and learned from. The war crossed a threshold where machines, communication, and organization fused into a single system. Victory began to depend less on who possessed technology and more on who adapted fastest. A force multiplier is something that increases the effectiveness of existing forces without increasing their size. In 1940, technology became a decisive force multiplier, not because it replaced soldiers, but because it amplified their impact. Faster communication multiplied coordination. Mechanization multiplied mobility. Air power multiplied reach. A smaller force, if better connected and coordinated, could outperform a larger one. This realization reshaped how war was fought. Air power underwent a conceptual shift in 1940. Previously, aircraft were often treated as extensions of ground forces, reconnaissance tools, or battlefield support. By 1940, air power became a strategic instrument in its own right. Aircraft could strike deep into enemy territory, disrupt production and transportation, challenge control of airspace. Air superiority was no longer a luxury, it was a prerequisite. Without it, movement on land and sea became vulnerable. Mechanization changed the pace of war. Vehicles replaced foot movement. Engines replaced endurance. Speed replaced mass. But mechanization alone did not guarantee success. Mechanized forces required fuel maintenance, coordination, planning, flexibility. When integrated properly, mechanization allowed rapid exploitation. When misaligned, it created logistical bottlenecks and vulnerability. The machine did not decide outcomes, the system around it did. One of the most important lessons of 1940 is that adaptation mattered more than invention. Organizational learning refers to the ability of institutions to absorb experience and adjust behavior. In 1940, some military organizations encouraged feedback from the field, allowed initiative and experimentation, revised tactics quickly. Others clung to established procedures. The difference was not intelligence or bravery. It was flexibility. Organizations that learned faster than events unfolded survived longer. Those that did not fell behind rapidly. Technology did not remove human limits. In many cases, it exposed them. Faster communication overwhelmed decision makers. Increased speed, compressed reaction time, greater reach, expanded responsibility. Technology amplified both capability and error. This made training, doctrine, and leadership more important, not less. 1940 did not introduce entirely new weapons. It introduced a new relationship between humans, machines, and decisions. War became faster than planning cycles, broader than battlefields, more dependent on coordination than mass. From this point forward, wars would not be won simply by producing better machines. They would be won by building systems that could learn, adapt, and act faster than reality changed. The technological shift of 1940 explains why traditional measures of power became unreliable. Numbers mattered less than integration. Invention mattered less than adaptation. Possession mattered less than use. And it ensured that the war ahead would be decided not just by strength, but by the speed at which societies could learn under pressure. Technology did not replace human judgment. It demanded better judgment, faster than ever before. Part 12. Misreading 1940. The victories of 1940 were real. They were also misunderstood. What unfolded that year created a powerful illusion that the future would behave like the present and that success could be repeated simply by moving faster. This illusion mattered more than any single battle because it reshaped expectations, planning, and risk tolerance. 1940 did not just produce outcomes, it produced beliefs. And some of those beliefs were wrong. Early success carries a unique risk. It does not merely reward effective action, it redefines what is considered normal. In 1940, rapid victories appeared to validate speed over sustainability, momentum over consolidation, action over caution. These conclusions felt logical because they were supported by recent experience, but they were drawn from a narrow window of conditions that would not persist. This is the core problem of overinterpretation. Victory bias is the tendency to interpret success as proof that underlying assumptions are universally correct. When something works, it is easy to believe it will keep working, even as conditions change. In 1940, operational success was attributed to doctrine alone. Resistance collapse was assumed to be inevitable. Structural weaknesses were dismissed as irrelevant. Victory bias turns outcomes into evidence of destiny rather than circumstance. It discourages reassessment. Momentum is powerful because it hides constraints. Rapid movement in 1940 obscured logistical strain, resource limits, industrial imbalance, human exhaustion. As long as advances continued, these issues appeared manageable. They were postponed, not resolved. Momentum created the illusion of sustainability, but momentum depends on conditions. Surprise, unprepared opponents, compressed timelines. Once those conditions fade, momentum falters. Strategic extrapolation occurs when leaders assume that present trends will continue unchanged into the future. In 1940, extrapolation took a simple form. If speed worked here, it will work everywhere. This assumption ignored context. What succeeded against fragmented opponents, unaligned coalitions. Systems slow to adapt might fail against prepared defenses, deep industrial bases, adversaries who learn. Extrapolation replaces analysis with expectation. Speed solves certain problems extremely well. It disrupts coordination. It overwhelms planning cycles. It creates psychological shock. But speed has limits. It consumes resources rapidly, requires constant resupply, magnifies errors, reduces margin for recovery. Speed is most effective early when surprise exists. Over time, opponents adapt, defenses deepen, and supply lines stretch. When speed becomes an assumption rather than a tool, it turns from advantage to liability. War is not a single event, it is a process. As conflicts lengthen, logistics reassert dominance. Production capacity matters more. Manpower attrition accumulates, adaptation narrows. Advantages 1940 temporarily inverted these dynamics. But inversion is not elimination. The structural realities of industrial war did not disappear. They were delayed. Early victory also reshaped psychology. Confidence increases, risk tolerance expands, doubt is interpreted as weakness. Internal criticism becomes less welcome. 1940 planted the seeds of later failure because it encouraged certainty in a war defined by change. The danger was not arrogance alone, it was mislearning. Lessons drawn from exceptional conditions were applied as universal truths. Speed was elevated from strategy to identity. Adaptation slowed because confidence replaced curiosity. Wars punished rigidity, and the rigidity that would matter later was built during moments of triumph, not defeat. Early success is informative, but incomplete. 1940 demonstrated what was possible under specific conditions. It did not guarantee what would remain possible as those conditions disappeared. The victories of that year were real. The conclusions drawn from them were fragile. Understanding this distinction is essential because the same beliefs that enabled rapid success would later constrain adjustment. 1940 did not just change the map, it shaped expectations. And in war, expectations can be as decisive and as dangerous as reality itself. By the end of 1940, the war no longer belonged to Europe alone. It had not yet reached every border, but it had entered every calculation. What moved quickly in 1940 had not yet been tested by time. What succeeded under shock had not yet faced sustained resistance. The deeper questions of resources, morale, industry, and ideology remained unanswered. Those questions define what comes next. 1941 will be about sustainability. The war will expand not only in geography, but in meaning. It will become increasingly ideological. Societies will be asked not just to fight, but to endure, to commit, and to define what survival truly requires. 1940 proved that the world could fall apart quickly. 1941 will test whether it can survive prolonged collapse. So as this year closes, the question is no longer whether the war will spread. It already has. The question now is how much the world can sustain and for how long.